This is the Parents in Sport podcast. Amazing guests, honest conversations, topics that matter.
Welcome to season 4 of the Parents in Sport podcast. I'm your host, Gordon MacLelland. I'm delighted to be joined today by high performance consultant, sports physiotherapist, and former international gymnast, Rachel Vickery. Rachel, thank you for joining us on the show.
Gordon, thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, really excited about today's topic, empowering choice and voice in high-performing young athletes, a topic that's certainly trending at the moment, particularly in the UK, with some of the campaigns that we've had. But before we get into that, can you just tell our listeners a little bit about your background and about yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm a New Zealander, or as a Kiwi, as we're called down under, but I live in Australia. So I've actually been in Australia for 20 years, but my work takes me all around the world, spent a fair bit of time in the US and been privileged enough to spend a bit of time up in the UK with some involvement with some Premier League coaches. Originally, as you said, started life as a gymnast. I was privileged to make it onto the international team, so competed at Commonwealth Games and World Champs. So I was about 6 years on the international team, then qualified as a sports physiotherapist, so just did what people most often think about sports physios do in terms of optimizing the physical performance side of athletes. And part of that training as physios, we do part of what we study is a lot of breathing related issues as well. So after my first job when I was working in a hospital, I ended up working in two different clinics at the same time. One where I was dealing with high performance athletes, optimizing the physical performance side. And then I was doing 2 days a week where I was in a private breathing clinic dealing with things, panics, anxiety, burnout, those sorts of things. And that breathing work led me in two interesting directions. One, ended up studying a lot more around breathing from a performance perspective. My master's thesis was in optimizing performance by looking at breathing related issues in athletes, not from a meditation mindfulness perspective, very much from a performance perspective. But then also a lot more about the human stress response and what happens to humans in high pressure and high stakes environments, and how and why is it that we can perform things in lower level environments or in training, but performance that falls apart under pressure. And especially when it's not, it's often put in the box of it being a mental issue, but there's a lot actually that goes on in terms of human neurophysiology and human stress response and those sorts of things that change fine motor skills, decision making, situational awareness, those sorts of things. So that's really where I've gone professionally in the last number of years, and been really privileged to have worked in many professional teams in sport, across football and NBA, many of our Olympic athletes and many different codes, and elite military as well. So that's probably
exciting.
Stop tour of my
Exciting. I mean, such a range of people. And I know, having spoken to you off air, we talk a lot about high performers and high performance. And I know that you're keen to define that, because I think the word elite and high performance perhaps gets bandied around a little bit too liberally, which probably is more with our use of language. So go on, you've got the floor. What does high performance look like for you? And when we're talking about these high performers, what are we seeing?
Yeah, and I think this is literally just my opinion, right? So I'm certainly not a guru or a take what I say as gospel in this one, but I think having been privileged though to have worked across high performance in professional sport and then elite military and corporate, and trauma medicine, so across a lot of different performance arenas, certainly what I see is the underlying common themes in terms of what sets people up to absolutely excel in those performance arenas or not. And it can be disappointing to say that in many of what we would so-called call high performance environments, we don't necessarily have high performance humans, and so that I think we're seeing that certainly globally around, what ends up leading to things like the need for independent inquiries in sport, or sport teams that just don't perform on the big stage or those sorts of things. So I guess more to answer your question about what I see or how do I define it, I think I define it very much as being excellence in craft, character, and culture, and a need for all three of those. And it's not enough to just be excellent in craft, as in like whatever your sport code is or your performance arena is. But it also needs that excellence in culture and also excellence in character as an individual. That it's excellence and not perfection. I think often we can get caught up in everything has to be perfect as opposed to, chasing excellence, that we're striving to improve and to be better. That we're showing up in a way that is bringing out the best of others and setting other people up for success. And in doing that, it lifts the whole standard and in terms of that performance arena. I think where it's, you see it as stand out where it's driven very much by a bigger purpose. It's not driven by ego and power and, it's all about me. It's about something that's bigger than self, that contribution into the bigger mission or the bigger goal or, whatever that is, as opposed to, it's all about me and what I can take and get from this. And I think those are typically, it's not a clear definition, but it's a number of things that I'll see across the board as to, an organisation that's consistently stand out and excellent and just has that vibe about it, in terms of true high performance versus the ones that want to say that they are and perhaps not so much, under the hood, it's a bit of a toxic environment and people want to leave and they just consistently don't perform.
Yeah, and I think that's sometimes also where we get that issue with the power of the badge, is it, as well? There's some teams and groups that have a badge, and then we ultimately assume that actually it's going to look like high performance. And actually, when you look at it, as you say,
Yeah.
behaviours and a lot of the things that are going on actually don't look like high performance at all. But it's all right because we're wearing a certain badge.
Yeah, and a lot of people, they'll make that. It's disappointing where I see it in professional teams, and it will be a top team, and not necessarily the champion team, but it might be, it's a top team in a league, but it's, you see some people who they get through that top team and they almost go, oh, I've made it, I'm good enough now, I don't need to keep striving and working on excellence. Yet, there's other people that you see who in that same team are just, they do chase those 1%. They strive to keep getting better and better. And I remember a number of years ago now, I was really privileged to do some work with some of the individuals with Golden State Warriors, who's an NBA team. And for those that aren't familiar with NBA, or the Golden State Warriors, they were defending champions, and player Steph Curry, who at the time was MVP and one of the best 3-point shots in the world at the time. And I'd watch Steph after every single training session had finished, and he would not leave the court until he'd sunk 100 3-point shots. So someone who was best in the world on a, championship winning team, who was still constantly honing his craft, on and off court. And to me, that just epitomizes someone who really truly lives and breathes high performance. And it's not for everyone, and I think we need to be okay with that too.
Yeah, and I think, you've opened up probably already, going off tangent straight away, a number of things where if we link it back to sports parents with young people in, performance environments or performance pathways, whatever you want to call it. But actually, this idea that we're trying to help our children strive for excellence, I think, whilst also not expecting perfection. I speak to a lot of parents where I sometimes wonder what they're expecting to see when they go to watch and they go to compete. And actually, if you compare what the children are doing, even to the very top of sport, actually, they're doing all right. And actually, they can't see this. I don't know whether this perfection model doesn't really exist, but definitely the work that we're doing is very much around those building blocks, that character development, the things in a human being that will give them the best chance of fulfilling their potential. And you talked about excellence in character. So what are some of the character traits that you see in high performers? What would some of those skills look like for you? Some of the things you're trying to develop. So some of those building blocks underneath that we don't always see.
Oh man, that's a great question. I think it's easy to jump to the easy ones that come to mind, right? Obviously about excellence, excellence mindset, and integrity, and humility and the willingness to do difficult things, and courage, and that ability to fail and not let that defeat you, and just fail at coming from a sport like gymnastics where you fail and you fail and you fail and you fail before you ever succeed in even getting close to executing the skill for the first time, having that ability to just keep getting up. I don't know if I can use this term on your podcast, so you can bleep it out if I can't, but that real no dickhead policy, it's like, don't be a dickhead. It's not hard, but it's amazing how many people will mistreat others or whatever. So I think those character pieces are really important. Grit is a word that gets thrown around all the time, isn't it? But I think that's a really important one too.
Yeah,
but also that ability to work work in a team, that it's not just about me, and it's respect for others, and it's respect for coaches, and it's it's gratitude, I think, as well, for the opportunity to do what you're doing at whatever level.
Yeah, and I think they're so integral, and talking to parents, we know sport's so messy. We know we can't always control final outcomes. We can obviously do our best to influence them, but actually those traits will stand our young people in really good stead for whatever walk of life they end up in. And sport still remains one of those amazing vehicles to help equip children with all of these traits, but only if we value them and we talk about them, and
100%.
We don't get too,
and we give space for them.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Well, it is, and I think you're spot on, Gordon, when you say sport is very much that forum for developing our future leaders, right? And I don't just mean our political leaders, but people who are going to be in industry, and people that are just contributing members of society, and all of that sort of stuff. And we just have to look around the world, and you look at the types of the divisiveness, and I guess the negative of seeing in society. And I think there's so much that sport can offer in terms of human development and character development, and understanding and accepting other people's differences, and embracing other people's success. I think that's a trait in and of itself that's often being lost a little bit. Is, hey, just because you've won doesn't mean I'm useless. You know what I mean? It's not a zero-sum game. I can celebrate your success at the same time as I'll feel disappointment, but it doesn't mean I'm less than if I approach it with the way of, oh, that's just a data point to reflect on where I need to get better. I can get better. But I think what we're seeing often, why I think that character piece is so critical in development is, as well as what we were just talking about the, developing humans that are going to, they're not going to be athletes for forever. They're going to be humans for forever, right? Is that sport does have a darker side, and especially in the really some of the higher levels in terms of performance and pressure that goes along with that. And I think if someone's self-worth and self-value has only been developed by external validation, oh, you're amazing, oh, you did so well, oh, you're on the national team, but that person hasn't developed the true inner sense of self-worth and self-value and true confidence, then their confidence is going to be quite fragile. And I think of that confidence as being almost like a sphere, and if it's only been developed from other people telling you you're amazing, then that sphere is quite brittle. And then when the pressure really comes on from external, maybe you're on the international stage or you're stepping up into a national team or whatever, and that pressure comes on, then that confidence just shatters, But if you've got that true sense of who I am, what I'm about, the confidence is real because I've earned that, I know I've done the work, then that becomes a very robust sphere. So you put the pressure on from external, and it can withstand that, it can stand strong and true in those environments. And in that, I know we're talking very much in the true kind of high performance sense, not sort of grassroots sport. But the stuff that our sportsmen and women get exposed to, even our coaching staff get exposed to, when you're on the front page of the newspaper or social medias, everyone on social media has got a comment about your performance or what you did or didn't do. Man, you need to have a strong character to be able to just not get rattled and thrown around by that sort of stuff, to be able to withstand that and not buy into it, both positively and negatively, because you also don't want to develop that huge ego of everyone telling you you're amazing, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, yeah, absolutely. I was watching something on Sky Sports last night, and it was all around leadership and different people in different teams, and Ben Stokes, the England cricket captain, and the way they've tried to change the way they've played the game, and it was very much this idea that we're only going to concentrate on the voice here in our group. We know that the analysts have got a job to do. We know the media have got a job to do. We know the broadcasters have got a job to do. But actually, do you know what? This is going to be all about us, and it's our voice, and that's the one we listen to. And I think that, that's what we're alluding to, isn't it? That internal, those internal values. I guess in a way, it's linked a little bit towards, the greatest form of motivation being intrinsic as well, because we know that if you're doing things, or purely extrinsically, I'm not sure it's a high quality form of motivation in the long run.
And I don't think it's sustainable, and I don't think it's sustainable once it hits the grind part of your performance career, which there always will be. There's always going to be, you're going to go through those phases where it's tough, and it's hard and it's a slog, and you might not be necessarily be seeing the return on investment of all of the training that you're putting in, and if you're not intrinsically motivated and you haven't actually fallen in love with the mastery of craft, that you're chasing the result. It's not motivating when you're just chasing the result and you're not seeing it coming. But if you've got that love of mastery of craft, and you can just, you're present with it, you're trying to work it out, you're trying to, you take the learnings and challenges and the difficulties as literally part of the journey that you're on and you're working on. Man, that's so much more rewarding when the results actually do come, and I think just those pieces too, right, around character and development, it's also that really critical part around identity, and about having an identity that doesn't necessarily mean tied up with your sport. It means, you're Gordon, who happens to be a, amazing footballer, but not, for me as a gymnast, and we see this a lot, particularly when there's younger athletes, I started gymnastics when I was 3, retired at 19. So my whole development as a human being was tied up in gymnastics, right? My whole identity, I was known as Rachel the gymnast at school. Now, the downside of that, and we see this a lot with younger athletes, and even, people that are going to be really successful in their sport, but when their identity is attached to their sport and they get all of the accolades and the validation and everything built around that, when they get to that point that they have then retired from sport, they're completely lost, because it's literally it's a grief process, really. It's an identity loss, and that's when we do see, unfortunately, athletes on the highest level who struggle with mental health or suicidal tendencies, or some of that sort of darker stuff, right? And so I think that character development starts right at the get-go. When I'm working with elite military and we're working with them very early in their careers, day one, I'm almost talking with them about the importance of developing their identity for when they retire. It starts early, so that you're actually and I think there's something that probably parents with kids can do a good job of right early on, right? Is that this person is your son or your daughter? It's a son, it's a daughter, it's a sister, it's a brother, it's a whatever else they are. They just happen to do the sport.
Yeah, absolutely.
They are that sport.
Critical. It's absolutely vital, isn't it? And as you say, it needs to happen at the beginning, because there's a couple of things there. We talk about the safety of home and children not being identified purely by their sport that they love because of them as people, their personalities, not because they're good at a particular sport. And likewise, those parents who invest time and money in their kids' sport, and I know we've talked about this as well, their children aren't commodities. The problem we've got with sport is there's no guarantee on investment, a return on investment, unless there's a wider meaning to it. Because if you and I could bottle a potion that created Olympic gold medalists or high-level professional athletes from the age of 13 onwards, we wouldn't be sat here doing this. We'd be in the Bahamas together. And 100%. I think that parents have got to understand that there has to be that wider meaning going on that underpins it, but also recognizing that as our children hit those teenage years and they they start to change, that we can have when they're younger, we can have a big influence, can't we? We can push them in the things, we can tell them what they're going to do, we can push them towards it. But actually, if it's not coming from them, regardless of what we may have done, they're probably ultimately going to turn around and say, actually, do you know what, I'm okay. Or failing that, they'll never fulfill the potential anyway, because the drive isn't coming from them. So there isn't that level that they need to get to in order to make those next steps.
Yeah, I've got a young guy that I work with, and it's a sport that it's basically $500,000, just to go up for a season, so it's not sort of a couple of pairs of rugby boots and your kit, right? So it's an expensive sport, and I think and I work with a number of individuals in this particular industry, and the pressure that they feel knowing that their parents are investing that much money in them is enough, and that they'll often feel that weight. They certainly don't need that reminder from their parents about, we're investing all this time and money in you, and all that does, it doesn't motivate kids usually in a positive way. All it does is load more pressure onto them. And when you understand the human stress response, you understand that sort of stuff actually shuts down performance. It doesn't in any way, because then the child or the athlete actually fears failure, and fear is one of the biggest things that will actually derail performance. Because someone will come into their performance arena going, oh, what if I fail? And if I fail, I'm going to let mum and dad down, or there's, I know that they're spending all this money and all this time, and, and it's just this, it's quite destructive, and so, I remember as a gymnast, mum and dad were incredibly supportive, but they were never pushy, and it was on me to start in the morning, and it was up to me to get myself up in the morning. And my dad was always up, but he would not come and wake me, and so it was, I'd get up, get ready, and dad would always drive me to training, but it was never, not once did either my mum or my dad wake me to say, hey, it's off to, time to head off to training, so I think there's that balance there too, isn't there, about the intrinsic, as you say, intrinsic versus that extrinsic, motivation. And I think, just coming back to what we were talking about before, identity, I think the other thing about that, right, is when it's tied up in sport, is that the self-worth and self-value can easily, if your identity is your sport, then your self-worth and self-value is tied up with your results. And so when you go through a form slump, or if you are, going through puberty and your body changes because you've gone through a massive growth spurt, or you've, put on a little bit of weight, or whatever it is, as you go through that phase and you go through a form slump, or you get an injury and you're not getting results, then your self-worth and self-value takes, and because you're not getting the results, right? So it's easy to go through that belief of, oh, I'm now useless, or I'm worthless, or I'm not good enough, or because I'm not getting the result. But me as a human, not, hey, I'm not performing as an athlete, and therefore here is the areas that I need to get better in. Does that kind of make some sense? And it's quite a nuance, but it's so powerful for athletes, when it gets mixed up.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think parents who, we talk about this with early developers and those that people, again, we use language, talented, they're elite, and actually, no, they're just pretty good 12-year-olds because that's where they are. And the trouble is that those children who are only given that external validation, only ever celebrated on outcomes, whether that be winning, scoring goals, scoring runs, taking whatever that may be. The problem is that becomes more challenging later on. If we haven't developed the underpinning character traits, then actually, if you're that child, if you think about it logically, you're going to think, actually, nah, you're okay. I'll go and do something else now. And that's because we've almost validated the wrong things. I mean, I'm not one of those people that don't get human nature. I mean, I love winning like everybody else. Absolutely.
Of course.
And you love it when your kids are, you're not going to celebrate and enjoy it. The problem is if that is the only type of dialogue that we ever have, then that's what...
Oh, yeah. And please don't get me wrong. Like, I'm not preaching, rainbows and unicorns and crystals and everyone gets a participation trophy. Do you know what I mean? Like, the reality of if you're talking real high performance sport, it's high performance sport. Do you know what I mean? And you're driven because you want to compete and you want to do well and you want to win, or that's awesome. And I think that's really healthy. And there's ways to make sure that that's done in a really, really healthy way. And in my professional world, particularly with that, arousal state control, performance in high pressure environments, one of the biggest things that we end up with, if I'm working with an elite or a professional athlete who's not, who's perhaps failing to execute under pressure, then normally when we unpack, the biggest thing in their self-talk coming into that performance arena is that they're so focused on the outcome. That becomes so pressure, because then, like, let's say I've got to win an Olympic gold medal, because the country is expecting me to do it, or, whatever, is that then there's something I might fail at. I might fail at that task of winning a gold medal, right? Is the natural consequence of that. And failure at a deep human level was a death sentence in terms of our primal neurophysiology and how that kind of works, right? And so as soon as I am in effectively a potential death, life or death sentence type scenario, my sympathetic nervous system kicks in, which is my fight and flight nervous system. Now, as a result of that, I tighten up, my muscles get more tight, I misread my arena of performance, I make poorer decisions, the biomechanics and timing of my body changes, my fine motor skills change, which is where my performance actually really starts to fall apart, right? As opposed to if I can come into that with more curiosity or very process focused, what do I actually need to do? And if I execute on those things that are 100% within my control, I've given myself the best chance to win the gold medal. But I'm focusing very much in that moment of giving myself an instruction of what I need to do next, not I've got to win the gold medal, but I haven't told myself how I'm actually going to get there.
Yeah.
Does that kind of make some sense? And so that's where, even at the top level, we end up really having to make some tweaks to performance. So again, it makes so much sense that if you've got little Johnny at home who's 8 or Sully who's 12, and there's dreams and aspirations for being, a high performance athlete, start building those building blocks at that age, not outcome focused. And to your point, celebrate the wins, and that's awesome and amazing. But more importantly, and how did you get there? And how can you make sure that you're celebrating? I had someone telling me the other day, they lost a tournament, or they lost a tournament, but they were so excited because they'd gone, but I had the best game I'd ever had, because they were so focused on working on improving a particular part of their round, as a golfer. And you go, that's cool, because that's growth for that athlete. That, they didn't win it today, but they learned something about themselves and their performance environment that is actually going to set them up even better in their future for the time that they might really need it when it's a crux moment, because now it's the big international.
Yeah, I absolutely. I mean, you're confirming all my biases really badly here. We'll be best friends after this. Anyway, I'm just thinking back to. I'm thinking back to the that intrinsic motivation, children taking ownership. Children, obviously, we want children to be communicating well as well, and there's obviously the challenges of that today with parents complaining about devices. That's certainly a topic for another day. Otherwise, we'll be sat here for 3 hours. But we wanted to look at this whole idea of empowering these young high performers to have choice and a voice in their sporting journey, and what does that actually look like, and what does it mean? So where are you on this? I mean, obviously we've talked about it. We've talked already without even realizing that we want them to have ownership. We want them to be able to talk. We want them to take control of their journey. Yeah. How do you feel about the whole thing? I mean, based on your own personal experiences and the people you work with.
Yeah, it's a minefield at the moment, isn't it? Internationally, potentially, in terms of where is the pendulum swinging. And I think it's certainly moved in the direction it needed to from where it was, sort of 10 years ago. For sure. Certainly, and I've seen this a lot in high performance sport, personal experience, as well as what I've seen, in different performance arenas. As a gymnast, man, we were told, what we'd eat, what we'd wear, when we had to be places, what we could and couldn't do with our school holidays, whether we could get involved in school, musicals or not. A lot of our sort of other choices outside of that training were actually dictated effectively by our coaches, so we didn't have choice. And we were very much told what to do. And in the actual training environment, especially as younger gymnasts, that might have been appropriate from a safety perspective, but it didn't evolve as we got older, and it certainly spread, too far outside of the training arena. And the downside of that was, retiring from sport and actually not knowing how to make choices. Now, I know that sounds like almost a ridiculous thing to say, right, as a young adult, but I'd not learned how to make choices on things because there was just never space to be allowed for choice. And so that was actually something I had to learn to do. And we see a lot, military environments, other environments where people have been in those situations. So I think it's so important that athletes and young people have that ability to advocate for themselves, that they know how to express what they do and don't want, and what's right and what's wrong for them. I think the balance to that, though, and I think it's something we're seeing a lot with coaches who are almost having a lot of fear around coaching now, because it's like, well, athletes can stay and do whatever they want, and I've got to pander to that, or I'm going to get, slapped over the knuckles for abusing athletes because I'm not giving them a voice. And I don't say that lightly when I laugh a little bit there. But I think just because athletes have a voice, it doesn't mean that's the only voice. Do you know what I mean? I think that the coaches have also got a voice in that environment. Parents have still got a voice in that, and I think especially, and it's got to be age appropriate, right? So if you're working with really young athletes, think about it as a parent. If you said to your kids, oh, look, UN rights of the child said, you have to have voice, and whatever you want is you can have that. Then if your child came to you and said, hey, I want pizza for dinner every night, and I want pizza for breakfast every morning, and I want ice cream for lunch if you play out that scenario, right, child's voice, that's what you're going to be giving your child. But you as the adult have to then step in and go, well, actually, if you look in the Charter for Rights of the Children, that also talks about the adults needing to protect children and look after what's in their best interest and development, and not setting them up for harm, right? So you've kind of got to play that off, that as a parent, you wouldn't just let your child eat all that junk food just because they said that's what they wanted. You have to step in as a parent and go, yeah, but it's also not in your best interest if we just let you do that. Yes, you have to eat your vegetables and whatever, right? So take that analogy and put that into a sport environment. I think it's still really important that there's children, as athletes, advocating for themselves and having a voice and having a say in what's important to them. But there's also the coaching development piece and the parental piece around what's in the best interest of that young person. Does that make sense from a safety and a development perspective as well?
I absolutely. Look, I think it's for me, it's the whole relationship piece that, everybody working together, everybody feeling that they can talk, not one voice maybe leading over all the others. Everybody feels that we've had those discussions that maybe in the past were completely closed off. And I think also as well, I think we have got, and I'm not talking about, let's say, the coaches right on the edge of the Olympics. I'm talking about the ones where we've maybe brought down some of those practices into the wrong stage and levels of sport. So when I'm out and about and you're in football academies, you're in gymnastics programs, and the parents are saying to you, do you know what, we missed a wedding last weekend because of a 10-year-old's training session or a sport, or we missed going on holiday as a family because we were chasing this dream because we were told that actually that would be the difference between making it or not making it, which actually it wasn't. It was complete rubbish. But what I'm saying is we tried to take some of those traits that we think is how we create high performers, and then actually we've probably used the power. It's a misuse of power, isn't it, by the people that are using it at the right time and at the right level that have led to this thing. Almost, I mean, we're talking about high performance today, but just infiltrating itself even across grassroots sport almost. I'm trying to be high performance, but actually no, this isn't a high performance. This is 10-year-olds in a local gym club or football club playing some football.
Yeah, and high performance at 10-year-olds in the local football club is going to be quite different, right? Because high performance in that environment, you can still have excellence in craft, character, and culture, but it's age appropriate, right? Which also means that there's space for other things and other sports, and overall development, and that bigger picture piece. And I always say that I think it always comes down to knowing your why. Why are you doing that? And I think that's on the shoulders of the coach to have, you don't just do stuff because that's what you've been told or that's what you've seen. You'd have to have a deeper understanding of, okay, but why am I doing this? And am I doing this just because this is what they do at the international level? So if they do it at that level, then that must be what it takes. And so I'm going to do that with my 10-year-olds. Or, do you actually have a deeper understanding of, training philosophy and those sorts of things? I certainly, what you're saying about missing out on holidays and all of that sort of stuff, families, that was very much my experience, 100%. Now, I think when it's, a couple of years out from a big international competition, you understand that that's actually part of what it is going to take, because all of those training hours are really important. And the consequence, I think I think you and I have spoken about the importance of choices and consequences. It's not that there's a right nor wrong, right? It's just that, if you want to be involved in that school musical or you want to play another couple of sports in the week, that's actually okay. The consequence of that is going to be your skill progression might be slower. You might be behind your peers in terms of performance in that particular sport. But if you understand and accept that, then awesome. I think helping kids understand, hey, if you want to eat junk food and, have crappy diet, then not that's okay. But do you know what I mean? It's not, and this is where we get into that extreme of, absolute rigidity around young athletes' diets at too young an age. And there's a whole nother conversation that we won't go down that rabbit hole. But just, you can make those choices, but there's a consequence to that. And so are you going to make the choice that's going to take you closer to the outcome that you want, or are you going to make a choice that takes you further away from that? And I think when we can actually help young people understand, hey, it's choices and consequences, and therefore you also have to live with the consequences, ruthless accountability of outcome is often what I talk about. Then that also is empowering athletes to actually learn to make choices that are empowered and make a choice for them. And then they need to be able to live with the consequence and not necessarily have their parents bail them out for that if they make a consequence that's, results in them perhaps missing selection for a team. And then it's not, parents running to the coach and abusing the coach for not picking Sally for the side. You know what I mean? If it was very clearly, put out there right from the get-go.
Yeah, and I think that, there's we even talk about it, I think, back to years of teaching in classrooms that, children can make choices, but actually it is about your choice, but there may be a consequence to that choice, just like we would with our own children. And I think that people who have been around sport, people who are experienced, are in a position to advise and support and say, actually, do you know what? You make that choice, it may not be the best thing. I think probably what we've probably got a bit too much of is that we've got people who dictate some of those things to young people. So yes, we can point out the consequence, but then we don't give them the choice. We basically say, that's why you're doing it, so you're doing it this way. So they haven't actually got a choice. You're giving them it, but they're not making that choice. And I also think, this was an interesting, I was thinking back to when I spent a bit of time in Singapore with gymnastics and the international program there. And I'll never forget talking to coaches about this, because they felt that parents or the children, let's say the children had said they wanted to be an international gymnast and they wanted to go to the Olympics. And the parent said, yes, I would like my child to do that as well. So that's great. So the child said it and the parent said it. But then the child was training 3 times a week instead of 6. And then the parents were having a go at the coach, explaining why the athlete hadn't made enough progress. And I think that trying to make sense of all these dialogues and all these conversations, and I think that again comes back to our kids. I mean, I think of my 2 children who have got some ability in their sport, but neither of them have come to me and said, Dad, I want to be professional football. I want to be a professional cricketer at any point. Now, I think the moment that the child, because it's ultimately their journey, and they say, actually, do you know what? I would love to go to the Olympics and I want some support with this. Actually, the dialogues we have with them, yes, they're going to have a choice. Yes, they're going to have a voice. Yes, they're going to be empowered. Yes, they're going to be consequences to those choices. Yes, they may need to change it. It's going to look very different to the conversations we have in recreational sport with a 9-year-old.
100% agree with that. And I think that's where potentially, I think we can continue to do things better, and particularly through communication and upfront communication, and managing expectations, and, having coaches actually have meetings with parents, in advance of a season and saying, hey, this is my philosophy, this is how I coach it. Not from I need to justify, but actually it's amazing how just filling some of those knowledge gaps can be really helpful, and understanding, hey, this is what it's actually going to take for skill progression. And I'm not saying you have to be here for those 7 training sessions a week, but actually it's going to it takes time, and it takes repetition, it takes skill. And so there's a choice that needs to be made, and either choice is totally fine. But please understand that might mean if your child's not attending as many training sessions, that's okay, but there will be a consequence to performance in that, and that might be okay too. As we talked about early in this conversation, not everybody wants to be a world champion, and that's actually totally awesome. Some people want to do sport purely just for fun, and that's so good. That's so good. But there's a different conversation if you really, if you're really serious about wanting to go there. And I still do a day a week in my clinic. And mostly so that I'm actually still accessible to young athletes, because I just have such a joy with working with them, because they're such sponges. And one of the things I'll often ask them when they come in is, hey, what's the big dream? And depending on what they answer will depend on, perhaps where I go and the advice that that I'm giving them. Because if they have no interest at all in going to the Olympics or getting into a national team or anything, then we probably have a different conversation than if they really do. And again, wrong. It's just they've just got different needs in that moment. But one of the other things I'll always do, and I'll usually do with children, usually from about 10, even that young, and they'll always come in with a parent. But I'll actually say to them, hey, I'm going to ask, Sarah to tell me her, what's going on with her in as many words as she can. And Mum, I'll just get you, or Dad, I'll just get you to stay silent, and then I'll once Sarah's finished telling me everything, then I'll get you to backfill and fill in any other gaps, because to me it's so important that young person is learning to advocate for themselves right from the get-go, particularly around their health and their medical stuff. Telling me about their injuries, telling me about whatever's going on for them and how they're feeling, and it's really quite a fascinating experiment. And usually I'll inevitably the young people do a fantastic job actually of telling their story. Often it will surprise the parent in the room about how much they can actually speak for themselves, and you can just see this child almost grow through that experience of, hey, I'm having a conversation about my stuff with an adult. It's very powerful for them. And often the parents are quite surprised how well the child actually does in advocating themselves. Now, hopefully that experience then empowers the parent to actually then let, their child speak a little bit more and start to have some of those experiences, but still with that scaffolding of, hey, the parent's still here to fill in the gaps and give any of the details that we might need. But let's let that young person speak and advocate for themselves first. Before that next piece. Just watching that too, it always gives me great insight to the whole dynamic, in terms of the child's confidence, in terms of the parental dynamic. There's often parents that'll just have to butt in at every second moment. And I'm like, yeah, I think I know where the problem might lie in that scenario.
And obviously, it's everybody, isn't it? Because coaches end up on the wrong side of this. That they may be criticised for being slightly dictatorial, children not having that voice, but actually, it's everybody. And I include coaches in that, in trying to be better. But actually, parents need to be good at giving their kids safety to speak as well and say some of those things. And one thing I always say to parents is, that conversation, if their children want to come to them and say, I don't want to do this anymore, must always be on the table. As much as you may sit here and listen and know that it'll be a massive punch in the stomach, which it would be for me, and I'd be gutted and I'd be thinking all the stuff we talked about earlier, all that time, all that money, everything else that we've done, and you're saying you don't want to do it anymore. Of course you would. It's a natural thing. Our kids have to know that they can come and say, I don't want to do this. Now, that doesn't mean you say, oh, yes, of course, little Johnny, well, we'll give up tonight. Obviously, that's, I need to investigate this. You need to see out this block of commitment, and then we'll review it and we'll have conversations and speak to relevant people. It's not about being all laissez-faire with it. But I do think that's important. But I also think coaches have got to provide those opportunities as well. And I think there's a lot who are doing some amazing work in their relationships now with young people. And ultimately, this whole dynamic, this character development, this safety to speak is still based around the relationship between organisation, coach, parent, and athlete, and how we bring everybody together. So everybody's got a voice, an appropriate voice. Everybody will have power at some point. But how do we use that effectively in the best interests of the young person in front of us? And looking back over the years in sport, maybe have we always been brilliant as coaches in terms of letting parents have a voice, children have a voice? Perhaps that some have struggled with that. And I speak to a lot of coaches now who I think are really fearful of it. As you say, they're quite scared and they feel like they're sitting ducks in many ways. Actually, if we give parents a voice and children too much of a voice, basically I'm just sitting here with absolutely nothing that I can say or do, and I'm going to be criticised. Many who are say are thinking, actually, I don't know if I want to do this anymore. But
I think that's you're right. We see that, right? But it's also that it doesn't, just because the parents have a voice and the athlete has a voice doesn't mean the coach doesn't have a voice.
No, that's
you know what I mean?
That's the key. That's the key, Rachel. That is the whole point. That is it. That everybody has got a voice. Everybody's doing it. But actually, yes, you do. You have a voice as well, because otherwise we're going to end up with a stage where teachers don't even teach anymore, because it'll be like, well, what's the point? I'm just sat here.
Absolutely. Yep. And it's it's who's actually got with the outcome or the mission that we're on, who's got the best skill, knowledge and ability to get us there, and that's where the coach's skill development piece and knowledge of the sport, and that's critical, but we also need the support from the parents, so the child feels well supported. Do you know what I mean? It's got to be a working together piece. I had a conversation. I ran a coach's workshop a while ago, and there was a coach who was concerned about, I constantly get bombarded by parents' emails and phone calls and asking questions about this and, questions about that. And I said, when did you last have just a parents meeting where you just pulled the parents together at the beginning of a season and basically just explained, hey, this is my coaching philosophy. This is how we sort of run. This is the expectations. This is the kind of choices and consequences piece. This is why I do these. Not that you're justifying your coaching methodology, but you're communicating, right? Because human behavior is, in the absence of fact, we always fill a gap with worst case scenario. So if your wife had said to you, hey, this morning, hey, Gordon, we need to have a chat when I get home from work this afternoon, but didn't fill in any other gaps, we immediately go to, oh no, what have I done wrong? Right? It's always the worst case scenario, right?
That's very normal. That's very normal for me, Rachel. So.
I doubt it, Gordon. But we do it. It's literally a survival instinct in our neurophysiology, right? And it's from when we were on the savannah in Africa. If there was rustling in the bush that I was standing beside, I actually needed to react as if that was a lion and jump away from the bush until I worked out that it was actually just the wind and it was okay. Versus if I stood standing beside the bush and I was just like, probably just the wind, right? But it turned out to be a lion, it was all over for me. So as a survival instinct, if we actually don't know the fact or the outcome of something, our brain always goes to worst case scenario as a survival instinct. So in terms of that parent-coach communication piece, I think, parents just often want to know, have you got little Johnny's best interests at heart? Is he safe? And are you setting him up in the best possible way? Right now, if a parent doesn't know that because they haven't got any insight to the training systems or the philosophy or any of that sort of stuff, then of course they're going to be phoning and emailing to say, hey, what's going on? Little Johnny's come home crying. What's happening? And when I had this conversation with this coach and I said, when did you last have a parents meeting? He just looked at me and he was like, you mean ever? And I'm like, yeah. I've been coaching for 20 years and had never just front loaded that, and I think there's so much that we can improve in communication by front loading conversations like that, not leaving things until there's problems, and even
proactive, haven't we? It's proactive and being transparent and helping paint the picture, but not, as you say, when the crisis is unfolding and us reacting. Same in education.
And then it's reacting.
We don't want to be reactive. Yeah. We want to be proactive. Yeah. And actually, being a bit more proactive may save a lot of pain for everybody involved in that process as we're going through.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah.
I'm just conscious of the time because I told you that the longest Working with Parents in Sport podcast was about the hour mark, and we must be quite close to that. So we're doing well here, which I thought we might, to be fair. Let's go back to for the final question then, because let's bring it back to sports parents, with it being the Parents in Sport podcast. If we're talking about parenting, sports parenting, high performing young athletes, we're wanting to give our children choice and a voice in the process. What's your best bit of advice for mum and dad? When do you start? What are the things you'd like to see, maybe?
I was thinking about that, and I was thinking that I think the best piece of advice I would want to give is actually just be a parent, and don't underestimate the power that being the parent is actually going to have on your child's performance. As a parent, just saying the stuff and having your son or daughter feel supported, feel like someone's got their back, someone believes in them, someone's proud of them, is going to far more performance than that technical piece of knowledge that you think you might know that you're going to pass on. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So I think we can't underestimate the power of that. I had a parent who was in a different coach's workshop in a parent way, and said at the end of a presentation I'd done, and the question was, look, I really want to do the best by my son, as a balance. I'm trying to balance off that coach versus parent piece. And where do you think the balance is? And I said to him, unless, and he was a really good, guy, And I said to him, look, unless you're a qualified coach and you're actually on pool deck and your son is actually in the lane that you're coaching, you're a parent, And I think it can kind of be that simple, really.
Yeah, and I think if we look to best parenting, that involves you having lots of dialogues with your children, getting them to talk through things that they're going through, how they're feeling. I think also that ability to understand why they're competing. I encourage lots of parents to say, have you checked in lately with why is your kid doing their sport? Because those answers are going to change. And I think we talk about empowering, but actually all of those things, if we just strip it back, are probably just really natural parenting things. I mean, I think my grandparents would be sat here listening to that today thinking, well, yeah, of course, Gordon, that's of course what you do, being a parent.
But stay curious on the as you say, on the why are you competing, or but not critical of the performance per se. I remember if I'd had a competition and I'd fallen off the beam, which is an inevitable part of a young gymnast's evolution, is you're going to fall off the beam in competition. And I remember my very well-intentioned mum on the way home from a competition, asking me, why did you fall off the beam? It's not like, I'm like, I didn't do it on purpose. Do you know what I mean? Now, she was asking it from a very genuine, wanted to help me get better, wanted to unpack it, But in that moment, I was like, I was already feeling bad enough about my performance. Like, I knew I'd It's like I was disappointed. I didn't really. It came across as if I, had either done it on purpose or why did you fall off? It's like, well, if I knew, I probably wouldn't have fallen off. So I think in those sorts of, that can, even those conversations from well-meaning parents can be perceived by a child as pressure, but even worse than that, I'm disappointed in your performance. And I think parents often underestimate just how much their words that they say to their kids, especially around performance, man, it can make or break the athlete, from a belief or from a pressure perspective. I don't envy parents. I think about my parents as when I was a gymnast. I was like, man, how did you do it? I think they found a really good balance somehow, and they did a fantastic job. But it's also, I can imagine how hard it is being a parent of so how do I find that balance between supporting but not pushing, showing an interest but not having that perceived as pressure. To your point, spending that money where you have to be so comfortable that you're doing it for the experience and for the growth of the young person, irrespective of what the result's going to be, and be okay with that, or don't do it. But certainly don't make your athlete feel bad, your child feel bad about it,
Yeah, brilliant. It's an absolute minefield, Rachel. Hence conversations like this where I guess we've tried to unravel lots of very complex things within that. I hope we've tried to make it simple, a bit simpler for those listening. And obviously there's a huge amount of things that we could have gone into around this whole topic. But Rachel, thank you so much for joining us on the Parents in Sport podcast. It's been a pleasure to have you on, and hopefully we'll get to pick up the conversation again sometime in the future.
Absolute pleasure, Gordon. Thank you so much for having me on.
Thank you for listening. Check us out at parentsinsport.co.uk.